The rain began before sunset and never truly stopped. By midnight, it was driving sideways across the glass doors of Seaforth Regional, the only hospital for 40 miles of dark coastal highway in the fictional town of Greyhaven, North Carolina. Inside the emergency department, under the hard white glare of fluorescent lights and the mingled smell of antiseptic, wet pavement, old coffee, and exhaustion, a nurse everyone had learned to treat like background noise stood absolutely still, while 3 doctors talked across her as if she were furniture. Nora Hale did not shift out of the way when Dr. Adrian Mercer dismissed her with the practiced impatience he reserved for people he considered lesser. She remained where she was, eyes fixed on the patient in the trauma bed, reading the body instead of the room, reading the chest rise, the neck veins, the skin tone, the way the left side barely moved, the way the monitor's rhythm was beginning to climb toward danger. The traveling respiratory tech was fumbling with a strap. An intern had gone pale. The patient's breathing was shortening into sharp, insufficient pulls. And Nora, in navy scrubs with rain still soaking through her shoes from helping unload ambulances in the storm, quietly said what few people in that room were trained enough to understand in time. The man was compensating badly. They needed to prepare for decompression now. Mercer treated the warning as an insult instead of information. He dismissed the suggestion with casual contempt, framing it as ambition from a rural intake nurse reaching above her station. The residents nearest him responded with the obedient laughter of people who knew that survival in a hierarchy sometimes meant laughing before you had fully decided whether anything was funny. Nora repeated herself without raising her voice. The patient was losing pressure. If they waited for imaging, he could crash. Only then did Mercer turn fully toward her, his expression carrying that polished kind of superiority that passes for leadership in rooms where image matters more than accuracy. He thanked her for the suggestion in a tone meant to reduce it, and instructed her to return to duties that matched her badge. For a breath or two, the room aligned itself around his authority. Then the patient's oxygen saturation dropped hard enough to shatter the illusion that time was still negotiable. A clerk shouted from the hallway that Life Flight had radioed in with another trauma. Weather diversion. Immediate landing. No one cared for the first seconds because the man on the bed was turning gray. Then the overhead speakers cracked with static, and through the interference one phrase came through clearly enough to stop the room cold. The incoming aircraft was requesting direct ambulance bay clearance for a priority transfer and had a message specifically for staff nurse Nora Hale. For the first time that night, Adrian Mercer stopped talking. Nora's face did not change, but something old and buried moved behind her eyes so quickly that most of the room almost missed it. The clerk looked down at the radio in confusion and repeated that they had said her name. Mercer recovered with a disbelieving refusal that sounded more offended than confused. Outside, a helicopter dropped low through the storm, close enough to rattle the windows and send a low mechanical tremor through the department. In the seconds that followed, something fundamental in the room shifted. Until that moment, Nora had been the quiet nurse who could be brushed aside, talked over, and mocked in ways polite enough to escape formal complaint. But the storm had just carried in proof that somewhere beyond Greyhaven's small assumptions, somebody important knew exactly who she was. Nora Hale had worked at Seaforth Regional for 11 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, which was exactly the amount of time it took a small-town hospital to decide what story it wanted to tell about someone. About Dr. Adrian Mercer, the story had been effortless. He was brilliant, polished, fast, formally trained in impressive places, and possessed of a voice administrators loved because it sounded expensive even when it carried bad judgment. He wore cufflinks to the emergency department in defiance of practicality, and he knew how to stand at fundraisers with one hand over his chest while speaking about rural excellence as if he had invented sacrifice himself. About Nora, the story was smaller and meaner. She was quiet. She had transferred in from nowhere anyone considered prestigious. She was good with paperwork, too serious, too old to still be just a staff nurse, too private to be trusted by people who equated friendliness with worth. She did not linger in the break room. She did not volunteer stories about herself. She did not perform confidence in the noisy, theatrical way that so often reassures insecure institutions. In a place like Greyhaven, silence got mistaken for weakness because most people had Neve. R learned the difference between reserve and fear. The truth about Nora was simpler and more dangerous. She did not need attention to know what she was doing. She rented a narrow white house near the marina where the porch paint peeled in the salt air and the windows rattled in high wind. She drove a 12-year-old pickup that smelled faintly of coffee and iodine. She called her father every morning before shift, checked on her widowed neighbor's blood pressure every Sunday, and kept her life partitioned so carefully that even coworkers who had stood beside her for almost a year could not say much about her beyond the fact that she always arrived early and somehow noticed everything. She noticed when the medication refrigerator drifted 2 degrees warmer than policy allowed before the digital sensor alarmed. She noticed when a new resident held forceps like a student trying not to drop chopsticks. She noticed which paramedics carried fatigue behind the eyes and handed them water before they asked. She noticed subtle changes in monitors, posture, tone, and weather, and because she noticed so much, she had long ago learned to speak only when it mattered. That habit, which should have made her invaluable, made insecure people deeply uneasy. Mercer disliked her with the particular resentment polished men reserve for people who quietly expose them. Nora had never challenged him dramatically. She had no interest in public showdowns. She had never tried to embarrass him. She had simply prevented errors, twice in her first month, in ways that left him no honorable route to deny the facts. The first incident involved a blood thinner dose ordered too quickly for an elderly patient with kidney failure. Nora had stepped into Mercer's office with the chart, and without accusation or audience, pointed out that the dosage was unsafe at the patient's filtration rate and suggested a recalculation before pharmacy released it. The second was worse for him because other people heard about it. A college athlete had collapsed at practice, and Mercer anchored early on dehydration. Nora had studied the ECG, crossed the room, and said with characteristic restraint that the pattern looked electrical rather than fluid-related. Cardiology later confirmed a conduction problem, and the cardiologist, not knowing the social cost of truth inside that emergency department, openly praised Nurse Hale for the catch. After that, the atmosphere around her changed. Mercer was too careful to display hostility in ways that could be quoted. Open aggression leaves evidence. What he practiced instead was softer, deniable, and often more effective. He smiled at her in front of witnesses. He praised her technical reliability while shifting her away from visible trauma work and into clerical heavy observation shifts under the language of staffing needs. He steered high-profile family communication toward louder nurses who looked better in emotionally performative roles. He framed her privacy as a limitation and her steadiness as a lack of charisma. He spoke in tidy sentences that sounded managerial rather than cruel. He implied that some people were valuable technically but not built for leadership in visible environments. He suggested that quieter cases better suited Nora's temperament. None of it was explicit enough to trigger discipline. All of it shaped perception. Residents mirrored him. New nurses learned when to laugh. Charge nurses who needed his approval for schedules pretended not to see what was happening. In a place as small as Greyhaven, local status bled into every corridor. Mercer sat on charity boards, golfed with donors, and carried himself as if social fluency were a clinical skill. Nora carried saline, adjusted lines, changed dressings, and got called sweetheart by men younger than she was. Yet the signs had always been there for anyone curious enough to question the story. Nora could tie a pressure dressing one-handed in the dark when the backup generator failed during a thunderstorm drill and half the department reached uselessly for flashlights. There was a scar along the inside of her left wrist that looked nothing like an accident and nothing like kitchen work. Whenever helicopter dispatch called in weather coordinates, her eyes lifted half a beat before anyone else reacted, as if she translated wind shear and rotor timing at a speed older than hospital routine. A retired Marine who came in twice a month for wound care had once called her corpsman before catching himself, and the word had landed with the unconscious respect of a man whose body remembered who had earned what. Someone had once glimpsed an old metal challenge coin in her locker before she slid it back into a plain canvas bag without display or explanation. But people in hierarchical environments tend to see what flatters the stories they already believe. If someone is quiet, they assume ordinary. If someone is modest, they assume limited. If someone declines to market their past, they assume there is nothing worth disclosing. On Wednesdays, Nora worked the early part of a split shift, which meant she stood between day staff too tired to be kind and night staff too preoccupied to notice small meanness. The mockery was always delivered lightly enough to preserve deniability. Someone once remarked that it must be a quiet night for the quiet nurse. Mercer, hearing it, added that if anyone needed a blanket folded with military precision, Hale was their best asset. Staff laughed. Nora finished capping a syringe, logged a line flush, and said nothing. That, more than any defense might have, unsettled the few people observant enough to notice. She never looked humiliated in the usual way. She looked restrained. There was a difference, and anyone with instinct for pressure could feel it. At home, she kept a cedar box on the top shelf of her closet containing 3 things she rarely touched: a service photo with half the faces blacked out by regulation marker, a pair of dog tags that were not hers, and a folded letter from the Department of the Navy thanking her for service rendered under circumstances it did not specify. She had never brought any of it to Seaforth. She had no desire to turn the most serious years of her life into identity theater. Greyhaven needed a nurse. Her father needed someone nearby. That was enough. Then the storm week came. For 3 days, the coast took on that dangerous, stretched feeling that precedes local disaster. Roads flooded in low places. Backup generators were tested. Boat rescues went out. Ambulances brought in wrecks, falls, chest pain, panic attacks, wound infections, and every delayed problem that bad weather worsens by trapping people with pain until it becomes intolerable. By Friday, everyone in the hospital was short-tempered. By Saturday night, the emergency department felt charged, as if tension itself were vibrating in the fluorescent ballast. Mercer thrived under those conditions because chaos often makes arrogance resemble leadership to less experienced observers. He strode through triage with an untouched coffee and a tie no one sensible would wear in severe weather, talking about throughput and bottlenecks with the detached irritation of a man who found emergencies offensively disorderly. When the triage clerk mentioned a sheriff's warning about a bridge pileup east of town, Nora looked up before anyone else. She asked how many vehicles were involved. The clerk did not know. Nora immediately instructed staff to call for extra blood runners. Mercer dismissed the idea with a neat, superior sentence about waiting for facts before performing preparedness. 12 minutes later, the first ambulance arrived. The first patients from the pileup were survivable and messy in familiar ways. A deputy with a fractured forearm and enough adrenaline to insist he was fine. A delivery driver trembling with shock. Then came the man who would alter the balance of the whole hospital. He arrived soaked, middle-aged, strapped awkwardly on the stretcher, skin pale beneath road grit. The medic giving report had rainwater streaming off her helmet and the clipped field cadence of someone trying to keep urgency from becoming panic. The patient had hydroplaned, spun, hit the rail, and taken a secondary impact from a utility truck. There was chest trauma from wheel and restraint, a brief loss of consciousness, diminishing breath sounds on the left, blood pressure trending down, pulse accelerating, oxygen saturation falling despite support. Nora was already moving as the report continued. She scanned pupils, watched the pulse waveform, and asked 3 focused questions in 10 seconds about anticoagulants, allergies, and abdominal distension in transport. She asked the patient his name, not for formality but for responsiveness. He tried to answer and winced instead. Mercer entered with 2 residents and the expression of a man resuming control of a stage he believed belonged to him. He proposed CT as soon as stable and instructed the team not to overreact. Nora looked again at the patient's neck. The veins were becoming more obvious. The trachea was not dramatically shifted, but the asymmetry of breathing was worsening and the blood pressure cuff returned an even softer number. She said he might not remain stable long enough for CT. Mercer ignored her and ordered portable chest imaging labs and screening. The patient tried to inhale and failed halfway through it. Nora leaned in, identified herself, and asked where the pain was worst. The patient gestured weakly toward the sternum and left ribs. The monitor alarm changed tone. A resident murmured that pressure was dropping again. Mercer ordered another fluid bolus. Nora, still looking at the patient rather than the hierarchy around him, said this was not a volume problem alone. Mercer snapped that he had heard her the first time. Nora answered that the patient was worse than he had been the first time. He turned on her then with cool contempt and reminded her she was not running the bay. Nora replied that she was trying to keep it from crashing. The patient gripped Nora's sleeve with a cold hand and rasped that he could not breathe. Nora made a decision at the speed that comes from training which has long ago become reflex. She did not grandstand. She began lining up the next needs in a voice so calm it cut through the room's rising fear. She directed airway backup, requested a decompression tray within reach, and warned blood bank of possible massive transfusion. Mercer countermanded her, and for one terrible second no one moved because hierarchy and survival were colliding in real time. Then the patient lost consciousness. What happened next passed in under 90 seconds. Nora flattened the bed, repositioned the oxygen, called for manual bagging, and had someone confirm the left side while watching pressure changes. A resident got the ultrasound down with fumbling haste. One look at the screen changed his face. There was minimal lung slide. Nora met Mercer's eyes and said what was now undeniable. The patient was obstructing. The rhythm worsened. Mercer hesitated. It was not a theatrical freeze, but a fractional delay stretched by ego, uncertainty, and the need to preserve his own authority in the instant before acting. Nora took the decompression kit and pressed it into his hand hard enough for the plastic to crack against his glove. She named the approach and told him to do it now. Pride had run out of time. Mercer acted. The release was immediate. The patient's chest movement improved. Oxygen saturation stopped dropping. Blood pressure climbed from catastrophic toward survivable. But Nora was already beyond that victory. She said he was still bleeding somewhere. His abdomen was tightening. Surgery needed to be called and blood kept moving. The resident dropped the ultrasound lower, stared, and confirmed free fluid. Nora had the first unit hanging before anyone else caught up. By the time the trauma surgeon reached the hospital through the storm, the patient was oxygenating better. Transfusion had begun. The operating room was on notice, and Nora had 3 lines of trend data committed to memory. When the surgeon asked what had changed, the resident answered before Mercer could control the narrative. He said Nurse Hale had called the deterioration before imaging. The surgeon looked from Nora to Mercer and back again, took in what needed no elaboration, and said that was good because it had bought the patient time. What she meant was that it had bought him life. The patient survived surgery, and by dawn his identity had spread through the building. He was Daniel Whitaker, Regional Director for Coastal Emergency Management and brother-in-law to one of Seaforth's most important board donors. In Greyhaven, names traveled fast when they linked medicine, money, and local power. By breakfast, the traveling respiratory tech had told ICU that Nora had seen the pneumothorax before anyone else. By noon, a medic told deputies that the quiet nurse had called the entire sequence before the fancy doctor caught up. By afternoon, even housekeeping had versions of the story, all of them bad for Adrian Mercer. He knew exactly what to do with professional embarrassment. Before shift change, he summoned Nora to a glass-walled consult room off the nurse's station and left the blinds open. He framed the previous night as an issue of process rather than outcome and slid a form across the table documenting that she had issued directives beyond her assigned role and acted after being specifically told not to. Nora stayed standing. She said she had asked for preparation. He accused her of countermanding him in front of staff. She said she had responded to a decompensating patient. He took cheap satisfaction in the vocabulary, mocking the fact that she used precise clinical language as if competence were pretension. He informed her she was being removed from trauma response pending review for everyone's comfort. Nora answered that the decision was really for his comfort. He warned her to be careful. She looked at the write-up, set it back on the table, and said the one thing he could not bear to hear. Next time, he should not wait so long. Then she walked out while the nurses' station fell into theatrical silence. The write-up should have remained internal, but hospitals leak social electricity through every crack. By late afternoon, staff were glancing at Nora with a sideways sympathy that feels suspiciously like gossip dressed as concern. Some believed she had overstepped. Some knew better and feared saying so. Most behaved the way people behave in vertical systems, siding with confidence until consequences make truth cheaper. The evening layered on smaller humiliations. A resident rooted a dosage question through another nurse, rather than asking Nora directly even though she had already given the correct answer. Mercer praised C. Hain of command within her hearing. Someone in registration whispered that she seemed like she was trying out for the military and got a muffled laugh. Nora continued working. She took vitals, reassured an elderly woman with vertigo, helped a fisherman with a hand laceration call his wife, and quieted a teenage panic attack without speaking louder than the room required. The more she refused theatrics, the more everyone else's performance began to look thin. Then came the chest pain patient. An EMS crew wheeled in a man with crushing chest pain at 7:21 p.m., and Nora moved toward him automatically, already reading the skin tone, already pulling aspirin and oxygen and reaching for the ECG leads. Mercer entered at the same time, saw her in the room, and actually stated within the patient's hearing that he had asked for her to stay out of critical cases. The man, terrified and gripping the rails, asked whether he was having a heart attack. Nora met his eyes first and told him he was in the right place. Mercer, suddenly aware of how he sounded in front of a frightened patient, softened his tone for the audience and suggested that Ms. Hale could assist from outside. But the patient had heard enough. Sick people often hear disrespect more accurately than the healthy. Nora stepped back because that case had enough hands. Yet something deeper shifted. Mercer was no longer punishing her in ways she could absorb privately. He was willing to erode patient trust if that was the price of reasserting control. Greyhaven noticed in the slow building way small towns do. The cafeteria cashier heard from X-ray that Mercer was putting the quiet one in her place. Two paramedics who had seen Nora work in storms shook their heads and said nothing. A house supervisor drafted an email she never sent. The trauma surgeon left a message with administration supporting Nora's judgment in the bridge case, and somehow that message was not acknowledged before the business day ended. Hospitals carry politics the way ships carry rust, quietly until pressure finds the weak seam. Around 9 that night, Nora got 5 minutes alone in the supply room. She stood between stacked saline cases and sealed procedure trays with one hand braced on a shelf, not because she was close to breaking, but because anger, if visible, could be weaponized by the wrong people. Her phone buzzed once in her scrub pocket. It was her father. She texted that she was busy and okay. He answered with a thumbs up and a fish emoji, his habitual way of pretending most things in life could still be handled by weathering them. Through the cracked supply room door, Nora heard two nurses discussing her in low tones. One repeated that Mercer said she was dangerous. The other said she was the calmest person in the building. The first replied that dangerous was not the kind he meant. Then they drifted toward speculation about possible military background and laughed it off as one of those myths people invent about anyone who knows how to fold gauze well. Nora closed her eyes briefly, not in pain but in recognition. The whole building was orbiting a truth it could not yet name. At 9:43, the storm surged again. Power flickered twice. Backup systems held. The charge nurse began preparing for possible diversion if roads flooded past threshold markers. Mercer used the moment to pace the station and talk too loudly into the phone about protocols, as if he were personally supervising the weather. Then dispatch called. An inbound aircraft was requesting emergency ground access with military escort and immediate clinical standby. Mercer frowned because there was no scheduled transfer. The clerk repeated, uncertain, that the aircraft was asking for a specific nurse. Mercer laughed as though the idea offended logic itself. The radio crackled again, clearer this time. The incoming team was requesting direct ambulance bay perimeter and specifically seeking nurse Nora Hale. The station fell silent. Residents looked from the clerk to Mercer to Nora. Nora lifted her eyes toward the rain-beaten windows as rotor noise deepened from distant thunder into undeniable presence. A security guard hurried past saying they were not even using the helipad, but were setting down outside the ambulance entrance. Mercer protested that it was unauthorized. No one answered him because the floor was already vibrating. From the ambulance bay, almost nothing was visible through the rain, except white beams shifting in rotor wash and puddles skidding backward across pavement under the force of the blades. Security had opened barriers. Paramedics shielded their faces. A maintenance worker held onto his cap with both hands. Everyone who could justify standing nearby had found a reason. Mercer planted himself in front as if seniority might claim the moment. The first man off the aircraft was a crew chief, broad-shouldered, instantly soaked, scanning the scene with the indifferent concentration of someone uninterested in hose. Pittle's social theater. Behind him came two medics wheeling a stretcher fast and clean. Then a third man ducked under the rotors and entered the fluorescent spill of the bay with the unshowy competence of someone who had spent long years near machines and danger. He was not in uniform, but there was command in the way he occupied space without performing it. Water streamed off a dark shell jacket. His eyes moved once across the room and settled directly on Nora, not on Mercer. Not on administration, on Nora. For the first time all night, Nora looked genuinely caught off guard. The man crossed the floor with measured urgency, bypassed Mercer's attempted introduction, and stopped in front of her. In a lowered voice, he used a name no one else in that hospital had ever heard attached to her. He called her Wren. The sound of it struck her like a door opening into another life. Her posture altered almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders aligned. Her attention sharpened. Something older than the hospital rose in her without fanfare. She addressed him quietly as Commander Vance. Mercer caught the rank and echoed it in disbelief. The commander, Elias Vance, finally acknowledged Mercer with the briefest glance, the kind given to background interference, and said that they needed Nurse Hale immediately. Mercer introduced himself as acting head of emergency medicine and announced that he would decide staffing assignments. Vance ignored the posturing and asked Nora whether she could still read a pressure waveform upside down. Without hesitation, Nora answered that she could do it better than most people could write side up. Relief, not surprise, crossed Vance's face. He said that was good because he had 6 minutes of weather window one unstable patient, and a hospital full of people who did not know what she could do. The patient on the stretcher was a man in his early 30s with the lean build of someone trained for hard use. His skin was too pale beneath rain and sweat. The monitor clipped to the rail showed a rhythm not yet catastrophic, but moving in the wrong direction. There was an oxygen mask in place, a pressure dressing at the clavicle, and the unmistakable choreography of a team already deep into serious transport. The report came fast. The injury had occurred during a training accident offshore. There had been blunt impact, probable rib fractures, intermittent hypotension, escalating pain, unstable oxygenation in flight, and a known medication sensitivity. The patient had remained conscious until shortly before arrival. Nora moved beside the stretcher as if the past several humiliating hours had not happened. She asked about the sensitivity, what medications had already been given, and urine output. She touched the patient's forearm, checked temperature and read tension with her fingertips, and then her voice changed in a way that made every nurse in the bay stop and recalibrate. It did not become louder. It became precise in a different register, carrying command without effort. She directed the team toward Trauma Bay 2, called for respiratory support, ultrasound in the room before the wheels stopped, type and cross, warm blood on standby, chest setup, and cardiac backup. This time, no one waited for Mercer. He still tried to stop the stretcher. He said he had not cleared her for trauma response. Vance halted and asked him on what basis. Mercer cited internal staffing review. Vance asked whether it involved clinical incompetence. Mercer said no. He asked whether it involved disciplinary action. Mercer said pending. He asked whether it related to patient safety. Mercer hesitated. Everybody saw the hesitation. Nora did not look up from the patient. She told the team to move, and the stretcher rolled past Mercer into Bay 2 with Vance following. Inside, the room snapped into a tempo unlike the previous trauma. Cleaner. Tighter. Nora assessed breath sounds, checked the dressing, watched the monitor, and mapped deterioration with clusters of questions precise enough to reconstruct the patient's decline minute by minute. She confirmed the last good vitals before takeoff, the present blood pressure, the falling saturation, and after briefly examining the field dressing, identified likely worsening hemothorax and increasing fatigue. They needed the attending and surgery immediately. Mercer, following because control dies reluctantly, folded his arms and remarked on her sudden indispensability. Vance asked whether he was there to help or narrate. A resident nearly smiled before caution reclaimed him. Then the patient stirred under the oxygen mask. His gaze drifted without focus until it found Nora, and something in him recognized her before full consciousness returned. His breathing hitched. He tried to speak. Nora leaned closer and told him to take it easy. He lifted a hand weakly and managed a single name through the mask and pain, not Nora but Wren. Mercer visibly blanched. Nora touched his shoulder. Eitlian told him he was okay and to stay still. Vance identified the man for the room as Chief Mason Reed and added that if he recognized Nurse Hale, there was a reason. The rank landed heavily. Nora did not indulge explanation. She said he was compensating badly, and Vance's expression held the smallest flicker of remembered history, as if the phrase carried them both through years of prior nights. The ultrasound confirmed fluid. Blood arrived. Surgery was called. A resident nearly reached for a medication that would have triggered the patient's documented adverse reaction, and Nora stopped the motion with a hand on his wrist, redirecting him to an alternate pathway before the mistake crossed from possibility into action. When he asked how she knew, she answered that this was not the patient's first rough transport. Mercer heard that. So did Vance. The implication was unmistakable. Nora was not improvising brilliance. She was drawing from knowledge, history, and a level of familiarity with this kind of care that the hospital had never bothered to imagine. Chief Reed destabilized a few minutes later. Oxygenation dipped, pressure sagged. The trauma surgeon arrived, assessed the scan and dressing, and began issuing orders. Nora was already halfway through carrying them out. When the surgeon asked who had briefed the room, Vance said that she had. The surgeon looked at Nora more carefully and told her to stay. Mercer started to object and was cut off, not theatrically, but with the kind of efficient dismissal reserved for non-essential noise. It was his first public deflation of the night, and it would not be the last. Chief Reed was moved to ICU within 20 minutes, more stable than he had any right to be after delay, weather, and blood loss. The trauma surgeon specifically requested that Nora accompany the transfer for handoff. Mercer objected again, but by then every objection he raised sounded less like leadership and more like a man trying to stop a tide with a title. Outside ICU, with rain dripping from the hem of his jacket, Commander Vance stood watching Nora deliver a handoff in clipped, exact language that bridged field management flight deterioration, and hospital response with the fluency of someone who had lived years inside those transitions. When she finished and stepped away from the bed, he observed quietly that she was still doing all of it in her head. Her shoulders lowered by half an inch, the closest she had come all night to showing emotion. She replied that he was still arriving in storms. He answered that storms were when people told the truth. Up close he looked older than the last time she had seen him, which had been years and apparently an ocean away. Not weaker, only weathered by command and consequence. He told her he had heard rumors that she might be at a small coastal hospital under a different name on a shift list and had not believed them at first. She said she was not hiding. He replied that she was working under a man who had publicly written her off an hour before he landed, and that kind of information traveled quickly in his line of work. When she asked why he was there, he explained the offshore training rotation, the weather, the accident, and the fact that one of their medics had seen the staff board. Nora corrected his use of her current name by repeating it as Nora Hale. He quietly corrected it back to Wren Hale. She looked away. He asked whether anyone at Seaforth knew anything about her history. She said no. He asked why not. She answered that she had come there to be useful, not interesting. It landed with more force than any self-pity would have. They were interrupted by approaching footsteps carrying administrative intent. Seaforth's chief nursing officer, Paula Grant, arrived with the overnight administrator, a compliance director from the regional system named Elaine Porter, and Adrian Mercer, who had recovered enough confidence to believe paperwork might still shield him. Grant acknowledged the commander and said they had not been aware of prior professional connections. Vance answered that no, they had not. Mercer attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding about Nora's role and began raising concerns about scope. Vance cut through him with a gesture and stated that he was not there because of a misunderstanding. He was there because the wrong person had been put in the wrong box by people who should have known better. Porter, smelling institutional risk with the calm efficiency of someone trained to follow liability to its source, asked for specifics if there were concerns about staff treatment or incident management. Vance said she would get them, starting with who had removed Nurse Hale from trauma coverage and why. Mercer admitted it had been his decision, justified after a conduct issue involving refusal to follow direct instruction. Porter asked whether the action resulted from patient harm. No. A near miss. No. Family complaint? No. Then what triggered it? Mercer fell back on chain of command. Vance answered with the kind of sentence that reorders a hallway. Chain of command, he said, existed to move competence efficiently, not to protect ego from witnesses. Grant tried to lower the temperature. Nora almost laughed internally at the phrase. Porter requested bridge trauma documentation, staffing reassignment orders, and incident reports. When Mercer called them internal, she reminded him that so was she. An ICU nurse emerged and reported that Chief Reed was asking for Nora again. Porter told her to go. Inside the room, Reed was awake enough to recognize her and old enough in his injuries to sound exhausted rather than dramatic. He remarked that she had vanished. She replied that he had been the dramatic one. He managed the smallest laugh. He looked around at the ICU staff, pretending not to stare, and noted that the hospital clearly knew something now. Nora said not enough. He told her that was probably good because she had always hated people knowing too much. She adjusted a line and blanket while keeping her hands busy so he would not see how much of another life his presence had dragged back with him. Mason Reed had stood on two of the worst nights of her life and one of the best, and some people carry years with them simply by surviving into the room. He asked whether he had said her name on the aircraft. She corrected that he had said her call sign. He smiled weakly and said that sounded right. Outside, Vance waited where he could see without intruding. He informed Nora that Porter was already pulling records and that Mercer was trying to frame the matter as personality conflict. Nora said that usually worked. Vance said not tonight. When she asked why, he answered that the moment Mason Reed recognized her, the issue stopped being a staffing disagreement and became evidence that somebody there had buried critical capability while pretending it did not matter. Nora understood he was right and disliked the phrasing anyway. Becoming a capability in someone else's narrative had always felt too close to becoming a tool. Vance then pressed the question he had likely been carrying since landing. Was she planning to keep pretending the only thing she had ever been was what her badge said? Nora looked down at the ID clip to her scrub pocket. It said Nora Hale, RN. It said nothing about cold water extractions, field trauma, prolonged care, or the 4 years she had spent attached to naval special warfare units as an independent duty corpsman and trauma specialist. It said nothing about stabilizing men in crippled boats in bad water. Nothing about a typhoon corridor and dwindling supplies. Nothing about leaving service, not because she had broken, but because her mother had been dying and her father had not known how to ask for help. She exhaled and answered that she had not been pretending. Vance nodded and said no, she had been surviving. Elaine Porter worked with the devastating patience of competent compliance officers everywhere. By late evening, she had assembled the bridge trauma chart, pulled security timestamps, and collected statements from the trauma surgeon, the respiratory tech, the triage clerk, and one resident who looked terrified to be telling the truth. Mercer kept trying to front-run the process. He explained context nobody had requested. He repeated bureaucratic phrases like workflow disruption and professional boundaries, as if polished language could sterilize motive. He emphasized Nora's failure to disclose prior high-acuity training, hoping omission would sound like dishonesty instead of privacy. He even suggested that Commander Vance's presence created undue external pressure. Porter's answer to all of it was note-taking. At 11:30, she convened everyone relevant in the staff conference room adjoining the emergency department because, she said, overnight shifts required immediate staffing clarity. The room filled with tired authority. Grant arrived. The trauma surgeon came directly from the operating room. Residents took seats with the look of people sensing that a story they had participated in might now be written down in legal language. The respiratory tech came. The triage clerk came. 2 charge nurses came. Mercer entered composed enough to imply control. Vance came after him. Nora stood near the wall rather than claiming a place at the table, which only made the room orient more firmly toward her. Porter began with the bridge crash. She stated the arrival time, the thoracic trauma, the deteriorating respiratory status, and the witness testimony that Nurse Hale identified likely obstructive deterioration before imaging while Dr. Mercer instructed staff to wait. Mercer began to respond with a lecture on sequencing in emergency medicine, but Porter continued. The patient had lost consciousness shortly thereafter. Decompression occurred. Subsequent findings confirmed internal bleeding, and delayed intervention would likely have been fatal. The trauma surgeon asked to weigh in said likely true. Mercer challenged the word likely as immeasurable. The surgeon answered that dead was measurable. The room fell still. Porter then moved to the staffing action taken afterward. Nora had been removed from trauma coverage, labeled insubordinate, and restricted without documented patient safety basis, nursing leadership review, or peer process. Grant asked Mercer why nursing leadership had not been contacted before imposing that kind of restriction. He called it a temporary operational decision. The respiratory tech said it had felt personal. Porter moved to the second incident. During the military transport, Nurse Hale had correctly intervened in a medication contraindication and accurately briefed the room on deterioration patterns before the attending completed assessment. A resident, Dr. Colin Avery, confirmed that she had been ahead of the room. Mercer insisted that was because she had undisclosed familiarity. Vance corrected him. No, he said, it was because she had mastery. Porter then addressed Nora directly for the first time in front of everyone. She asked for a clear answer for the record. Did Nora hold, or had she held, advanced military medical training relevant to trauma care beyond what Seaforth staff generally understood? Nora looked slowly around the room. She saw Mercer with the expression of a man waiting for confession and advantage. She saw residents who had laughed because laughter was socially safer than thought. She saw nurses who had looked away from small wrongs until larger ones made neutrality impossible. She saw Vance offering no rescue and no spectacle, only witness. Then she answered simply that yes, she had. Porter asked her to specify. Nora explained in the same even tone with which she might have listed current medications. She had served for 8 years in the Navy. For 4 of those, she had been attached to naval special warfare in trauma and field medical roles. Her final operational assignment had been as an independent duty corpsman with advanced evacuation and prolonged care responsibilities. Her current civilian RN license was active, accurate, and fully disclosed. Her prior service records had not been required for her employment at Seaforth. The room did not move. One resident looked as if someone had physically altered the geometry of authority in front of him. The triage clerk seemed to remember every petty task she had ever handed Nora without a second glance. Porter asked about the call sign. Nora hesitated for a fraction. Vance answered. It was Wren. The reveal did not produce applause. Realignment is quieter and more brutal than that. The trauma surgeon gave a short, almost amused nod and said that explained the blood bank timing. A charge nurse made a breathless sound that carried equal parts disbelief and apology. Colin Avery stared at Nora as if learning all at once that titles and ability were not arranged as neatly as he had been taught. Mercer tried a final defensive angle. He said carefully that military experience did not override civilian hierarchy and that policies still existed. Vance answered that he was correct, which was why the issue was policy misuse by Mercer rather than experience by Nora. Porter agreed. Then she laid out the chain with bureaucratic clarity. Nurse Hale had raised clinically valid concerns in a deteriorating trauma case. Those concerns were supported by outcome and witness testimony. She had then been restricted from trauma participation without nursing leadership review, formal peer process, or documented safety basis. Subsequent behavior by Dr. Mercer in the chest pain case may have undermined patient confidence. During a second high-acuity event, Nurse Hale's advanced judgment again proved materially beneficial. She closed the file and named it accurately. This was not a personality dispute. It was a potential retaliation matter. Mercer protested. Porter remained calm, which made the protest sound smaller. Vance added one more fact. Chief Mason Reed was alive upstairs. He had recognized Nurse Hale while hypoxic and unstable, not because of sentiment, but because under pressure people remember the medic who brings them home. The sentence settled over the table like a weight. Porter then asked why Nora had left active service, and for a split second Mercer lifted his head as if scandal might still save him. Nora answered briefly that her mother had been dying and her father would not say he needed help, so she had come home. No one touched that answer. Vance added with visible restraint that she had also finished her service with commendations most people in that room would never hear the details of. Nora stopped him with 2 words. That was enough. He nodded immediately. The deference mattered. The room had just watched a commander obey the nurse they had mocked for being too quiet. Justice, when it comes in institutions, is rarely theater. Eichel, it is procedural, time-stamped, witnessed, and very difficult to outrun once formally recorded. Porter requested that Mercer surrender his badge access for trauma, ordering pending immediate administrative review. Grant removed his authority to alter nursing assignments effective at once. The overnight administrator called the regional chief medical officer at home, because once retaliation enters a hospital record, certain people lose the luxury of sleep. Mercer stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. He accused them of overreacting to optics. Grant answered with tired honesty that they were reacting to facts they should have examined sooner. Then Mercer turned toward Nora not as a superior, but as a man who finally understood that she had become the fixed point in the room and resented her for it. He told her she could have disclosed all of this, that she had let people underestimate her. Nora met his eyes and said the one sentence that stripped away every excuse. He had not needed her history to treat her fairly. The residents looked down. The respiratory tech looked directly at Mercer. Porter concluded the matter for the shift. Dr. Mercer was relieved from direct supervisory duty for the remainder of the night and was not to enter active clinical areas unless specifically requested by the attending covering in his place. A formal review would follow with HR, medical staff leadership, and nursing administration. Mercer laughed once thinly and asked if this was really over one nurse. Porter answered that it was over his conduct around one nurse, and there was a difference. He seemed ready to argue until he looked around and realized witness numbers had turned against him. Then he left without another word. The aftermath unfolded in smaller, more human corrections. Staff returned to the department carrying a new awkwardness. Mockery that had floated so casually around Nora only hours earlier now felt radioactive. People who had laughed too quickly avoided her eyes. People who had stayed silent looked as if they wished silence could be revised retroactively. One of the newer nurses, Jamie, who had repeated Mercer's jokes more than once, stopped Nora near the medication room and apologized in a rush for all of it. Nora, looking more tired than triumphant, told her to do better with the next quiet person. Jamie's eyes filled because the sentence landed exactly where it was intended. Later, Colin Avery found Nora restocking airway kits and admitted he had known he was scared in the bay and should have backed her the previous night. Nora told him then to back the truth next time before it became safe. Near 1 in the morning, the regional chief medical officer arrived in rolled sleeves and weather-inappropriate shoes. He spent measured time with Porter, Grant, the trauma surgeon, and finally Nora. He did not ask self-important questions. He asked only whether she had felt discouraged from raising clinical concerns, whether that discouragement was isolated to the bridge trauma, and whether she wished to file a formal complaint. Nora thought not only about herself, but about every future nurse whose competence might be dimmed by hierarchy before it was allowed to matter. Then she said yes. He told her to write it plainly. That was the real hinge, not anger, paper. By 2 in the morning, rumor had spread through the entire hospital and into Greyhaven itself. The quiet nurse had been military. No, more than military, special operations medic. No, a commander had come for her. A helicopter had landed outside the ambulance bay asking for her by name. Some versions immediately grew ridiculous the way local stories do, but the core of it held because too many people had seen too much. In ICU, Mason Reed improved enough to contribute one dry statement when the chief medical officer asked if he had anything relevant to add to the review. Reed said that if Hale said move, they should move. If she said wait, they should wait. If she was quiet, they should listen harder. The physician wrote it down. Around 3 in the morning, Vance found Nora in the vending alcove off the east corridor holding a paper cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The storm had softened to rain. They stood in the small stillness that sometimes arrives after crisis, but before fatigue fully takes over. Nora told him he had not needed to stay. He answered that yes, he had. When she asked if he meant for the review, he said for her. Then, with the faint humor of old teammates who survived difficult history by sounding ordinary, he clarified that he meant professionally, mostly. It was the first almost normal moment of the night. Vance looked toward the dark windows and said she knew Seaforth would ask her to step up now. Nora said she knew. He asked if she was going to. She thought of her house by the marina, her father's strange little text messages, the small life she had built out of grief and choice and useful anonymity. And she thought,